Hello and namaste. I am Bharat Grover, welcoming all of you on behalf of Vernalis India. I'm a founder member of Vernalis, which is a small, well-known consulting firm which has been a niche for itself in transformation work across India. Personally, like working on strategy and large-scale transformation. And as all of you would know, that large-scale transformation necessarily involves executive coaching, and that is how I'm a part of this panel today. It's my privilege to be here today. And with this, I'd like to hand it over to Mark Argent, who's our moderator for this session. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Bharat, and welcome everybody onto this webinar. I'm delighted to see the length of the list of people who've joined us today, but in particular, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. I'll invite them to introduce themselves in a moment, but just so you know who I am, I'm a coach and organisational consultant based in Cambridge in the UK. My coaching accreditation is as an analytic network coach, which is one of the spaces where psychoanalysis meets coaching. And I come into this territory from a background in psychoanalysis and spirituality. And could I pass on to the other panelists, beginning with Bharat?
Thank you, Mark. As I've already introduced myself, I work with Vernalis India, which is a consulting firm that works on large-scale transformation with companies both in India and abroad. We have a small team here that works on transformation, and necessarily that involves coaching. So happy to be here today.
And maybe Claire could go next.
Certainly. My name's Claire Vane. I'm based in Cambridge. I never escaped having come here for university, having grown up in the north of England, which is currently even more locked down than we are. I'm a graduate in classics and modern languages, and my great passion is the piano, apart from HR. I set up my own business 20 years ago, having realised that I'm an entrepreneur rather than an in-house HR director after a very long career in-house. We're a full-service HR consultancy, and we provide services right across the employee life cycle, from recruitment marketing through retention, through performance management to exiting. And the thread that really runs through our work is about releasing potential both in organisations and in individuals. I personally am fascinated by why certain organisations get stuck and why individuals get stuck. Like Mark, I have a deep interest in psychoanalysis, and I find myself in coaching using psychoanalytic methodology as well as coaching methodology, even though it's a different part of the intervention spectrum. I suppose what drives me is communication and language, and that's a thread that runs through all our work, the importance of joining the dots and not making assumptions. And thank you so much for inviting me.
And if I follow around people in the order they are on my screen, would Yili like to go next?
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Yili. The surname is Xu Yili, but you can call me simply Yili. I live in Shanghai, China. I have over 20 years working experience as HR leaders in multinational companies in China, including DHL, Philips, Intel, and Colgate. I have stayed in China all my life, but I have regional responsibilities, which give me the opportunity to visit all the countries in Asia Pacific, including almost 10 times to India. That's where I know Bharat. I love to share my observations on life, career, and the interrelations, both in public speech and also on social media, especially on LinkedIn, where I have quite a big following, close to 2 million to be precise. So anyway, it's my pleasure to join today's panel, and I wish I could share my insights with you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. And could I pass on to Roslina?
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Roslina. I'm a lawyer by training, nonviolent communication mediator, and a 6-time entrepreneur. And prior to that, I've had a few stints in corporate and the government sector. My coaching focus is very much somatic and compassion-based, and my specialty is to help senior leaders in high growth organizations more effectively lead regional multicultural teams, because professionally, my specialty is in digital, in innovation, and also in the high growth sector. Currently, I'm based in Singapore, and I'm as well completing my executive doctorate where I research the intersection of corporate social innovation and network effects in the digital domain. Now, what makes me come alive is unfolding intimate conversation whilst partaking in a meal prepared with love. And even though the meal is missing today, I very much look forward to a degree of honest and intimate conversations with all of you here. Thank you.
And Gabby.
Thank you. You must have left the best till last, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm Gabby. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. So good morning, good afternoon, and for me, good evening. It's great to have everyone join. I've founded Higher Curve, my company, about 2 years ago to bring my services to the world. I've been unlocking the potential of humans across organisations and educational institutions for over 30 years. From an international leadership career in education, living and working across 4 different continents, I expanded my approach to growth and development of leadership to the business world about 15 years ago. And I love inspiring both old and new generations of leaders in organisations. My current focus is to help eradicate destructive leadership styles that impact on well-being, dampen ingenuity, and waste human potential. I like to mix serious play, visual energy, and the latest research, particularly on the future of work in our organisations. And I'm happiest when I'm collaborating with others and gaining inspiration from others, as well as giving inspiration. And I'm certainly very much looking forward to being inspired by the amazing panelists on this panel. And taking advantage of the diversity that we bring from all corners of the world. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for introducing yourself. One of the things that kind of caught my ear as you were talking was a sense of where the organisation sits in relation to coaching work. Lots of the theoretical writing about coaching implies it's a one-to-one relationship and nothing more. And yet so often when we're delivering coaching, the organisation is very much part of the process. Quite often as the body that's actually taken the initiative to cause the coaching to happen, sometimes asking for reporting back, sometimes invested in the outcome of the coaching, possibly not in quite the same as the coachee. To begin with, I'd just like to ask the panel to share some of their perspectives on organisation-initiated coaching and perhaps how it differs from one-to-one work without an organisational context.
I'm happy to start if you'd like.
Thank you, Claire.
I find that coaches come from 3 sources. One from therapists, usually analytical therapists. One from individuals who are in transition, and I often refer to it as transition coaching rather than executive coaching. And the third is from companies. I'd say it's roughly a third, and a third. And I find the interventions that commence through a company referral are far, far slower to take off. I've just started coaching a senior sales individual who works right across the globe, and he's been brought to me through a contravention of a disciplinary procedure. So he's come unwillingly. I'm well into the coaching, and I've really got him on side. It took 6 weeks for our terms of business to be signed because the legal department of the multinational from whence he came Took 6 weeks to agree our terms of business. There's nothing extraordinary about them. So the start was very slow. And in addition, I had to get him on board with the idea of coaching, knowing that in the company's eyes, he'd committed a misdemeanor that actually, in moral eyes, he hadn't. So I find the intervention much harder. I'm also required to report back to the HR department. Fortunately, I know the HR director from a previous company where we did some work, but I'm wrestling with how much I say and how much I don't say, because my relationship is with the coachee, for better or worse. I think there's also a difference in certain very large consultancies where I've coached people, where the individual coachee, willing or not, has to pay a portion of the coaching fees. And although these are peripheral things around the act of coaching, they slow things down and skew the process.
Thank you, Claire. And I've certainly met all sorts of contexts where the seemingly peripheral things turn out to be much more important than one had imagined, and the organisation can fall into that category. I wonder how other people feel about their experiences of working with organisations.
I may add some perspective from China. I think in China, the concept of coaching catch up really slow, because even 30 years ago, if you talk about coaching, people think people like Sir Ferguson of Manchester United, someone who trains you physically and get you in better shape. So it picks up really slow, but like everything in China, once we grasp the idea, it just boom, become a huge thing. And now we probably have too much coaching offerings in the market, because some totally underqualified people are also entering into the business, you know. And in this process, the concept coaching become a bit of diluted. Everyone can be a coach without proper accreditation process, and they offer all kinds of things. So the company has a dilemma. On the one side, they want to have a high qualified coach to help their employee to develop, but on the other hand, they are not sure how to, set up the criteria to make that happen. And I have to say, some of the bad coaching experience really gives the organization some second thoughts in this area. So they rather stay put than moving forward.
Thank you. And that, in a sense, raises interesting questions about training and accreditation, and whether sometimes the coaching accrediting body is another organization in the process of setting up a coaching thing. I wonder how it looks in other parts of the world.
I kind of want to bring a slightly different perspective in that I do agree there is the perception of a dilemma in terms of decision maker nested within organization. And that could be in part because there has been very, very, very little invested in helping decision makers understand what exactly are the boundaries of coaching. I've come across situations in Europe which are generally more socially oriented and much more expecting in terms of the human-centric approach to coaching, whereby coaching has been seen, even though it was framed as a high performance intervention, as a punishment. And they're basically asking, when do you as an organization get to say how I behave, what I should be thinking, and how I show up at work, as long as I'm delivering in that sense? So in this particular case, even though the one-on-one coaching intervention at a very high price tagline to the company was commissioned for a year, and the coachee went through it for a year, supposedly willingly, at the end, there was a lawsuit. There were other peripheral issues, but it was a really interesting dilemma, because the commissioning manager was really taken aback and say, I thought this was a good thing. How did you turn around and make this into a, you should not be meddling in my personal worldview? So that is a downside of not framing something properly. And I find that a lot of coaches don't actually engage in that conversation because they are so anxious for the business. One perspective.
Absolutely. And in a sense, the organizational layer is one that's terribly easy to miss. Just in terms of the dynamic of this call, I recognize that there are 6 faces on the screen and a couple of hundred people actually in the webinar. We can't actually see everybody in the webinar on the call, but we're keeping a very close eye on the chat. So if people have questions they'd like to put into the melting pot, please add them to the chat and we'll see which of them we can feed into the discussion. We're also about to put up a little poll to tell us a little bit more about the audience, simply because if this were a face-to-face gathering, we could look around the room and take in everybody, and it's that much harder to do online. Whilst people are beginning to think about questions to put into the chat, I'm wondering how this might look from an Australian perspective.
Thank you, Mark. I'm actually just reflecting on some of what Claire has talked about and also Roslina in regards to when the organisation initiates coaching for an individual, and often it can be a reactive approach, and it can be when there is a perceived problem or a perceived deficit in capability that the idea of coaching is then initiated by the organisation in order to fix maybe the deficit. And to me, that's always a very interesting part of the whole coaching conversation and the agreement, because at times having too much of a focus on reacting to the problem as opposed to maybe being proactive with the coaching relationship and helping to move people forward maybe from a position of strength and looking at the value of being able to increase capability might have something then to do with what Roslina brought up in terms of the problems that were occurring with the individual who was being coached, who by the sounds of things, it seems towards the end that it was seen as punitive and not beneficial. And I think often when organisations tend to react too much to the problem and then they put coaching on top, it can give the whole coaching relationship that negative feeling right from the beginning that can be difficult to undo. So, and I find that happens a lot, and that it tends to almost be part of a human condition where we're happy to just leave things as they are as long as there are no problems, and that we only jump in and react when there becomes a problem. And I like to see that the coaching relationship being used not only for that, that's important, but used in a more proactive way where we're encouraging people to improve on their current capabilities as well.
You're making me wonder what happens when the problem isn't necessarily the coachee's problem. I've been involved in a number of situations where you hear one story and then you look around the organisation and realise the problem is somewhere else. So in a sense, you're coaching the problem person when the problem lies somewhere else. I just wonder how people experience navigating the organisational context and how you might set that up.
Personally, I think the way you set up the coaching at the beginning is critical. And I think the more time invested in what one might call the planning phase is the most important. Roslina mentioned boundaries early on. And I think boundaries are everything, not just in coaching, but in day-to-day people management. And if there's a choice for me between crossing boundaries, I would not cross the boundary of the relationship with the individual. And I think it's very interesting, one or two of the big global consultancies make individuals pay a contribution to their coaching, gives a different kind of ownership. And although one might want to be puritanical, and not mix the issue of money and remuneration with coaching. Nevertheless, remuneration has an effect in its various guises of driving behaviour. And if there's a choice, my relationship would always be with the coach. The other thing is, we live in a world full of terrifically rigid legislation. In the UK, we have the Data Protection Act of 2018. So we're dealing with often personal sensitive information, and therefore I can use the law not to commit to transmit certain things to the employing organisation on the basis that would be a breach of data protection, which can be useful. So sometimes the rigidity of legislation actually helps you rather than hinders.
So quite apart from,
Sorry, Bharat, go ahead.
I agree with a lot that has been said here. About track between two people. The moment we often stakeholder, it can often be a controlling stakeholder. Controlling more because they control the contract, and it is not necessarily the formal contract with which
Right,
they wield power.
Forgive me interrupting you, Bharat. We lost you at the beginning of that. Could you start your intervention again?
Sorry?
The signal went bad.
I agree, Mark, that while coaching is essentially a contract between two, the coach and the coachee. However, in organizational context, there is a very is that this is not an stakeholder in some sense. Form, as Claire mentioned, seek information, seek to direct the purpose of the coaching, alter the objectives, and distract the coach from the objectives of serving the coachee. The challenge, of course, before us is how do we harmonize these three and find solutions wherein we maintain the primacy of the coaching contract with the coachee, at the same time ensure that the sponsor or the initiator, which is the organization, is satisfied enough to keep funding this initiative and giving the time and space needed for this contract to fulfill its obligations, which is to achieve the coaching objectives. I think the challenge always has been to harmonize the organization's quick win initiatives and focus on certain goals versus the coachee's need for both time and space to buy into the program and to maybe alter the objectives which the organization is kind of pushing down, whereas the coachee is resisting. So these, to me, are some of the dynamics that come into play the moment we switch from a personal contract, which is non-organizational, to an organizational initiated coaching contract.
Thank you, Bharat. What you've put me in mind of, in addition to what you said, is the little hitch with the Zoom connection misbehaving as you started to speak, which is one of the facts of life that's, in a sense, part of the outside world that has an impact on how we experience coaching. I remember a long time ago, Bruce Irvine came up with the really interesting comment that when the technology misbehaves, there's usually something going on. I found it quite useful to think that actually, rather than treating that as an irritant, the question might be, what's the technological hitch offering to our process? In this case, it might be, is there something that's quite difficult to hear? And I think Bharat's comments about where the organization sits could be in the category of something that can sometimes be quite hard to hear. Speaking of things that are hard to hear, we're about to put up a poll just to get a sense of how many people on the call are coaching practitioners or coaching aspirants. So let us give a sense of who's in the room and everybody a sense of who the others are. So if you could fill out, this will give us a sense of where we are. and putting us panelists in our place. There's a little notice here telling me the host and panelists can't vote. So we're sitting to watch and see what emerges. And I wonder if you could vote on that, and then we'll close the vote for that and see what the results look like. So, whilst we're waiting for the poll to be captured, one of the ideas that we've been throwing around within people associated with Vernalis is thinking about some different typologies of coaching. And Claire already hinted at a slightly different model a few minutes ago. This isn't so much to say that there's only one way of doing it, but sometimes thinking about different modalities, different typologies can help clarify the thinking, and at a very practical level can help with some of the practical contracting process. For example, if you're running a coaching practice which has some template letters of engagement, it can give you a sense of what templates you start with. We've been thinking of this in terms of for preparing of future leaders, overcoming of limits or constraints, so going from good to better, remedial coaching and conflict resolution. It's not by any means certain that that's the only way of thinking about these things, but we thought for this next segment of the call, we would explore that over the best part of an hour from now, so give roughly 12 minutes to each of those segments. And I'm sort of looking partly for insights from the panel and partly from a sense of whether actually this framework or this typology might be missing something. We're just going through those. I wonder if panelists might like to say something about their experience of coaching, where the sense is that they are preparing future leaders. And at the back of my mind, I'm thinking of a conversation with somebody who's now the managing director of a major publishing house, who at the time of the conversation was, in inverted commas, just an editor there, who was delighted that his firm was investing in him doing an MBA, which wasn't automatically saying he was going to become managing director, but was certainly steering him in that direction with a sense that his talents have been recognised. And just before we dive into that, just looking at the results, I can see that 38% of us are coaching practitioners, but there's quite a range of other people on the call as well. But what's the panel's experience of coaching which is preparing future leaders?
I face a big dilemma when an organisation refers somebody for coaching. First of all, getting the buy-in, which I talked about, but I am there to facilitate growth in that particular organisation of that individual who's already in a leadership post, maybe in a new and bigger leadership post than previously. And yet the very setup by the company is almost a complaint of certain kinds of behaviour that is taking that individual towards the door. So one might be facilitating and growing somebody in a leadership post, but they may already be heading towards the door. And the very behaviour that has brought the individual into the coaching, some sort of misfit within the organisational structure, takes them towards the door, and yet we've been hired as coaches to retain them for the organisation. And I often find myself, not deliberately, but by default, because the contract is with the coachee, the psychological contract, undoubtedly, that I find that I am coaching them out because the intervention is too late and the company is naive about the setup of the relationship, which has to lie with the coachee. So there's a dilemma about coaching in and coaching out and coaching up.
Thank you. In some ways, that might be coaching, the really interesting overlap between coaching of future leaders and sort of remedial coaching. I wonder what, and of course, there's something about coaching, an organisation that initiates coaching of a future leader that causes them to develop their aptitudes and get headhunted to go somewhere else. I wonder what people's experience are of organisations which have commissioned coaching for somebody within the organisation in the anticipation that they will go on to an accelerated career path within the same organisation?
When I was working with my most recent employer, a global software company, there's a program to develop two leaders in Asia Pacific to take higher positions, and actually both succeeded in taking the position. As part of the program, one key element is engaging an external coach. So I would argue coaching itself is always one element of a whole kind of program. And in this sense, it's the most common and easiest to sell because the executive has already agreed to invest in him or her. So if we say these are the trainings, these are the projects, and we also need to get him a coach, it's easy to sell. So in that sense, the high potential development is most easy to sell. And also we will get the strongest motivation fit because that guy also want to move into a higher role. So he could say, I want to get feedback. I want to know where should I improve, what leverage can I have in the company, what further projects I can have. So in that sense, this is the most straightforward approach in terms of coaching. And usually all the pieces will come together. The company wants to invest. The executive coach has an easy way to find the motivation fit, and the coachee himself or herself usually are very active in the process, drive things forward. That's my most recent experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would agree with just particularly what Yili finished with there, and I think working with and preparing future leaders can be one of the most exciting and rewarding coaching relationships you can have, for that very reason that Yili touched on, that up and coming leaders are often exuberant and they're highly motivated. They've maybe not had years of creating bad habits that can be very hard to break. In saying that, though, I find it very interesting. I find with young up-and-coming leaders who are maybe very fresh with their leadership skills can already be picking up what I call the destructive leadership styles and not even be aware of them. So it's actually an interesting sort of two ends of the spectrum where you've got up-and-coming leaders who are very ready to learn, but at the same time may have some bad habits to unlearn as well. And I think organisations, to help organisations realise that as well, that it's important to start the coaching relationship, I think, as early as possible, especially with your up-and-coming leaders, to set good habits at the beginning that can take them forward.
And Bharat,
Thanks, Mark. I agree with Yili and with... Hello?
Hello?
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I agree with Yili and Gabby. Coaching young leaders or future leaders is one of the most rewarding and among the easiest forms of organizational coaching. They're excited, and most importantly, there's no conflict between the objectives of the coach and the organization. They tend to align very easily for this initiative, whereas for some other forms of initiative, there tends to be conflict. So it's among the easier forms of contracting, generally in India and in the Middle East and South Asia, which we worked in. This form of coaching tends to be a mix of group coaching and individual coaching. So it kind of optimizes on costs. I would say at least 60 to 70% of it is group coaching, and maybe 20-30% of it is personal individual one-on-one coaching. But this is one of the most, I would say, one of the easier interventions in coaching. They are friendly, eager to learn. There's not much unlearning to be done. So it's good fun to do this.
Thank you. I've just seen a comment about COVID-19 turning up in the chat. Yesterday, I was in a conversation with somebody about how organizations are adapting to a real shock in the world economy, which of course throws up a question about how an organization itself can change direction. And I'm wondering if coaching future leaders carries the risk that it's teaching them to function in the way the organisation expects, which helps the organisation carry on in the same direction, which sets up the organisation for a problem if it has to change direction in the way many people have had in the last 12 months. I just wonder if anybody has any feelings on that.
Mark, may I jump in? I have an itch to scratch. I've been trying to see if I could keep it there. Even we're going to spend quite a bit more time together, I actually have one provocation to table for everybody in the panel. And that is the fact that I think as coaches in 2020 and beyond, we must be a lot more capacious in how we think about contracting. It is completely contrary to the reality of very complex organizational systems that are reducing costs, expecting people to triple portfolio, matrix organizational structure, offshoring. There's just too many things, right? For coaches to insist that my only contract is with a coachee. I think we have to it's a moral question. If I really want to help the coachee to change, I have to spend time contracting and negotiating and discussing the wider structure. I'm not suggesting we spend too much time, but the sponsoring manager, how many are there? The HR, right? And it's not to frame something as a problem, even though that may be how it can come to us, but it's to frame like, don't focus on the strategy, right? You guys are upset about something. I'm only talking about one topology here. Forget about what you think the problem is. Tell me what you need from this. Because ultimately, we are trying to help the individual assess whether or not there is a way to express something about himself or herself in a way that is values aligned with the organization. But the responsibility cannot and should never be on the individual. It has to be a system's responsibility. That, I think, is the clarion call if we want the coaching industry to remain relevant for the next 30 years. So that's my kind of provocation that I'm tabling, which I think kind of segues into your question as well. Are we there to fit a square into a round hole? Or are we there to kind of like, let's see how this fits, but both party has to make an effort.
And maybe there's an extra layer there, which is that a coach is coming in as an outsider to the specific situation. And if somebody's just square peg to be fitted into square hole, they wouldn't need the coach in the first place. So we're already bringing something that's different. And maybe there's something about holding the space of difference to let explore.
But isn't there a moral duty about recruitment fit and performance management? And we're taking it for granted, perhaps, that an organisation has its values defined, has its mission and vision defined. And I seem to spend an awful lot of time, and even more when we're working remotely, because it's important to get the relationship cemented over the airways rather than face to face. Spend a lot of time talking about that, how the individual values are or are not congruent with the organisational values. And looking at it from a wider human resources perspective, I find that a lot of even big organisations don't have a proper competency framework about behavioural competencies that enables both the organisation and the individual to talk about behaviours, so they even lack a language. So part of the early phase of the coaching relationship is articulating what is going on, even before you start on the interventions you might embark on.
And it looks as if Bharat's got some things wanting to say.
Mark, thanks. I'd actually like to integrate what Roslina and what Claire were saying. Roslina, you were talking about the need to contract in a manner that acknowledges the organizational realities. I'm completely with you. The challenge is not so much in the fact that coaches tend to ignore organizational realities. I don't think we do. The issue is that contracting is complex. The whole panoply of contracting should involve what the expectations are, as well as what the coachee's expectations are. somehow, sometimes the organizations tend to overlook that coaches could have a viewpoint on this. And merely because they are initiating and they are funding that initiative, they tend to ignore or devalue a coach's viewpoint. So that's a potential conflict that we need to navigate around. And the other issue which Claire was mentioning, which I quite agree with, but again, I would like to expand on. So there is an overall contracting, which we need to do with the organization, but internally the organization needs to respect that whatever its vision, whatever its competencies, etc., are, it is for the coach to interpret how to work these and weave these into the coaching intervention to achieve the objective. Excessive direction or excessive directive control, or the need to participate, or the need to dig into details of what's happening, tends to compromise the process, not just from the confidentiality point of view, but also from having multiple cooks spoiling the broth. So it's important to contract in a manner that acknowledges organizational realities, but at the same time creates space for the coach and the coachee to build a bond of trust without an overseer, or without a stakeholder who is suspect in the eyes of the coachee intervening from time to time.
Thank you, Bharat. In some ways, I'm conscious that the conversation has moved in different directions, which I think indicates to me the complexity of what sounds like a simple process of preparing a future leader. This is often a lot less simple than it sounds. I'd like to move the discussion on to a different typology, or a different type rather, and think about coaching that's about overcoming specific constraints, moving from good to better. So for somebody who's already experienced in their role, but there's a sense of potential to do it better, to improve. Just wonder how that's looking for people, and possibly we'd be denying reality if we pretended that COVID-19 hadn't happened. And there might be something about the spanner in the works that's come from that as well, in terms of showing up all sorts of things that we wouldn't be seeing if everybody was all working in the office. So that how people have taken up their role in working remotely. But how do you go about coaching people who are trying to move from good to better within an organization?
I think, again, when you look at who might be initiating that type of a coaching typology, if it has a positive feel to it, because it is looking at somebody who's doing well currently, and it's a proactive approach to take someone from their current position and further improve them. And I think whether that's initiated by the individual or the organisation, that it can be seen as a very positive growth-focused approach, which of course all coaching relationships at its very base is around helping the individual move in their growth and progress forward. So I think this typology as well, even though it can be framed as overcoming limitations or constraints, can be viewed from that very positive aspect, that it's ideally the organisation is encouraging its leaders to improve upon their current state and take the organisation forward with them. So when it's viewed in that sense, that this can be an easier contract as well, and a relationship that you can have with the individual.
I think this covers a lot of people in the organization. I even can argue the majority of the employees belong to this group, that they are doing a good job, but they can always do better. So in terms of resource allocations, the organization will have a hard time to allocate much more resources into this area. So the usual attitude of the managers and the HR are, yeah, they need coaching so it can be better, but it should be part of their manager's daily routine management cycle. So it's difficult to put extra resources in it, but on the other hand, they are expected to get more coaching and guidance from their managers. That's what I want to add to Gabby's point.
I think this typology needs to be refined slightly more, given this is my domain. There is the first domain, which is you have been promoted into a larger position, and we want to support your growth and your ability to take on more responsibility or a larger region, right? The second one would be we need you to expand your agility toolkit. Like maybe you are engineering or IT, we want you to take on a larger team, and we need to give you help to expand your soft skills, your relational skills, right? Then there is you have been promoted into a position and you're not doing as well. And this is, I would not consider this remedial in a sense. It's like you don't know what you don't know until you step into it, right? And now we're giving you coaching to support you in maybe identifying where the boat is leaking and can we stop it and can it float again. So within that three, I would like to, and this pertains to the future leaders as well. I think it's important that as coaches, we come in and we know whether or not there is something very concrete on the table. One of the companies that I know of, this is regardless of your age, if we think that you're a high potential, there is a whole series of jobs that are coming up in the next 12 months. You have been identified as a potential leader, and we want to develop you. And I think this is to Yili's earlier point, in a holistic intervention program where coaching is part of a lot of other things we're doing to help you move up internally within the organization. Now, in that kind of case, it's quite easy to assess a coach's impact. Did the group of people you coach, were they promoted, right? Over a 3-year period, did they move? And I think it's important, I mean, as much as we as coaches love to work with exuberant people, we also have to identify within the organization, are there concrete goals that we are working towards? Otherwise, it feels good, but not quite moving, perhaps.
Thank you. And just picking up on one of the comments that appeared in the chats about diversity and inclusion, I'm wondering, in terms of this style of course approach to coaching, it's very easy to work with the usual suspects to help them become what the organisation expects, which is actually to lose all the people who don't quite fit the usual structure, usual suspects constraint. So that's race, gender, and so on. I wonder how the coaching that's improving performance works when it's actually helping somebody bring the richness of being a little bit different from the organisation, which may not be what the organisation thinks it wants, but is actually something that enriches the organisation.
I might jump in again. I think it's always very interesting when coaching is approached from a very open mind from all of the people within the relationship, and the very strong understanding that the coaching relationship and the journey that you take somebody on is in one sense unknown. You can start with very clear, concrete objectives from the organisation. This is what we want from the coaching. This is what we need. The individual may also have their own understanding at the beginning, but I think particularly when the coaching relationship is done very well with a very good coach, that the end point can often be very, very different from where everybody started. And to my mind, that's a really good example of a good coaching relationship that you uncover through the journey and through the discussions. You uncover maybe a different pathway. And sometimes that can then become something that is at odds with the organisation's objectives, and it can uncover gaps and extra problems. So in one sense, that's the sign, I think, of a good coaching journey, but at the same time, it can open up issues from the organisation's perspective, and that maybe the end point ends up being different. And that can always, that can create tension. as well. And it can certainly be difficult, I think, for organisations to agree or to remain consistent with sponsoring coaching when they start to understand that maybe it's not going to go exactly the way they want it to go, and it's not going to fit into their box and their objectives. And trying to bring those two together can be very interesting.
I think you're right. And doesn't this bring us back to the very first question about where the boundaries lie? And I know that more of the time, even with leaders with potential, I'm ending up following the Coachees agenda because that is where the relationship is, rather than with the corporate agenda. And so starting off the relationship in the right way seems to be key, and we eventually come back to that initial question that sets the tone and the direction. And often one does end up in a completely different place from where you thought you might end up.
Just adding to Roslina's point, it's easier to identify the objective for the high potential different programs, the coaching path. Is he or she promoted at the end of a period or not? But for people to moving from good to better, it's difficult to, because people have different targets and so on. And also, hypothetically, if a group of people are doing good job, but they are not doing a better job, maybe sometimes it's not their problem. Maybe sometimes it's the manager's problem, or the system, or the motivation, or the performance management, or the bonus. So once the coach gets involved, he or she may find the root cause of the problem, and it has nothing to do with people's capability, which the coach is not in a position to intervene. So just hypothetical.
I think what is interesting so far in this conversation, and this pertains to the diversity and inclusion question, and thank you, Yili, for pointing that out. The longer I do this, the more I question whether or not as a coach, it is my role to get to the root cause of the problem. And I'm not very sure about that. I think what I'm there to do, to Claire's point about the psychological contract I have with my coachee, is to honor their perspective, honor their reality, and go with that. And I'm not there to identify the root cause of the problem. That's a consultant's role. And you can be a coach consultant, right? But I think if we're talking purely about coaching, which is also to say that in the realm of diversity and inclusion, I've been seeing quite a few questions and comments about organizational culture. They are organizational cultures that says, we want to be a diverse and inclusive organization, but it's our definition. So if you don't gel with our definition, it's a highway for you, right? So there's a bit of irony in that. But bringing coaching to the next level, apart from honoring the coachee's agenda and where the coachee wants to go, I think it's critical to ask, to what extent do I also need to help the coachee negotiate the external relationals, right? If it's having an impact on the coachee, it has to show in some ways in the relationships that the coachee is able or not able to manage. And it's not about right, it's not about wrong. Can we get a coachee to a state where they can negotiate those relationality with a lot more joy, impact, and success, right? The reason I got into coaching is because my husband over 20 years ago was coached and our relationship improved. We can't divorce the personal from the professional. If we do our job right as a coach, our coachee will have impact beyond the organization. I believe that is not too much to ask.
I have a question. Mark, are we still on future leaders, or are we going across the entire panoply?
We had moved from future leaders to overcoming constraints, and it was actually, I think, probably time to move on to thinking about remedial coaching. And I suppose part of what's been in my mind, hearing what people have been saying, is a thought that sometimes a person has a model of the organisation in their mind, and in the context of coaching and being heard at depth by a coach, they get a chance to rethink the model and discover that the way they thought about the organisation is in here and doesn't actually affect the organisation. But how does this look in the situation where we've actually been brought in to coach somebody where it's remedial coaching, where there's a sense of a problem in someone's performance, which coaching is being looked to in some sense ameliorate or fix?
So, in fact, Yili and I worked on one such issue, and it's been one of the most remarkable coaching experiences that I've had. A very senior manager. The organization starts with a very positive and pure intent of wanting to provide an opportunity to the coachee to overcome some dysfunctional behaviors and become far more effective in the on a larger scale. But the moment it is organization initiated, it creates a context or a possibility that the coachee is not in a receiving mode. And there's a challenge of trying. This is something which Claire was alluding to in the beginning, of trying to contract with the coachee and get him or her to buy in to the entire coaching process itself. And he or she doesn't really want to stand out because at senior levels, it's quite a big issue to be seen as having warts or to be less than perfect. At times, it's a difficult issue to navigate. And it's, of course, we were fairly successful with this, and I know, but the journey was a very challenging one. For a long span of time, even getting the coachee to agree to be a part of this intervention joyfully or to even explore this intervention was a challenge. And at the same time, there was organizational pressures that were coming in strong. The clock was ticking, and it became a pressure to produce results and to share progress in a very visible, very detailed manner, which would compromise the coachee and which was counterproductive. So the coach was having to deal with these pressures of organizational initiation, coachee reluctance, organizational need for data and progress reports of a very detailed nature, wanting to control and dominate. So these were some things that come very strongly to the fore in this form of coaching, which we can call remedial. In other forms, it is not so. I would say the organizational sponsorship and organizational initiation can be very supportive, very, very positive as well. But in remedial coaching, though the intent is very pure and very, very positive and noble, it is not seen very positively by the coachee, and therein lies the challenge.
If I may add to Bharat's story, just refer back to my previous conversation with Roslina. There's only so much a coach can do to remedy. At the end of the day, I think Bharat did a great job. He comes back on track, more or less, but still, it's not the ideal situation. Like I said, there's a lot of relationships he needs to negotiate with the organization and other departments, which I agree with Bharat at the time. Maybe we need to have a group coaching session or whatever workshop to really solve the issue. But it's out of a coaching assignment, but that's a real solution to that problem. It's not an individual problem. But at the end of the day, the organization did go with it. And finally, that senior manager left the organization after a period. Now he's a partner of the organization, which builds a much better relationship for him and the organization. So it's a win-win solution. So I think remedial coaching can only achieve certain level of success. It's up to the organization's willingness and also how much the people around him wants to change their behavior or change the way of their work. So it's always a very tricky situation to be.
I'm wondering if there's sometimes a risk that the remedial coaching gets mobilized to treat the coachee as if they're a failure, and how we might act in a way that changes that, so that in some senses it's being contracted because of a problem, and can be pivoted into helping somebody come to their full potential?
I think, if I may again be the devil's advocate, I think it's extremely critical for coaches who are being called in for this kind of coaching to ask a very honest question. Are you doing this to make sure that when you fire the person, you can say in a court of law that you've done everything you can? And I have come across this kind of situation. It's much better to know that this is the case than not, right?
Yeah.
And in that kind of situation, I think the best thing that the coach can do is just healing and reconciliation, because the outcome in some way is already written on the wall. I don't have anything else to say beyond. I think we need to kind of expand what remedial means at this stage from a very real organizational perspective.
But I find that very provocative. Thank you, Roslina. And it does bring up a lot of feelings for me as well in regards to when you get to this place where the organisation is wanting to initiate coaching for a remedial. I think it's very important from the coaching perspective to get an understanding of what happened before or what didn't happen before, and the amount of support that maybe this individual did or did not receive prior to finding that the organisation is possibly reacting now at the end of the process where it's been left too long at times. This can sound very defeatist in a way, but unfortunately, it can happen a lot. And sometimes the coaching relationship can help to avoid that issue of waiting too long for the problem to occur. So I think too, when if you are brought in at this stage, it needs to be done very carefully and very sensitively, but to try and understand what has happened in the past, or maybe just in the recent past, that has occurred that the individual finds themselves in that position. That can be difficult, but I think it's an important part to understand if you are going to be able to help the individual and again, maybe uncover some issues with the organisational structure or the way that they deal or they don't deal with managers that are becoming a problem. That I think can be one of the more difficult parts of the coaching, but critically important to not shy away from it. It can be easy to not want to talk about those things, but I find in the long run it can be a lot more beneficial.
It's interesting what you say. Oh, got a sound problem? Is it better now? I found myself more often than not coaching somebody very senior who has been done through the disciplinary procedure for bullying. And here I am with a chief executive who's very experienced, possibly has done coaching in the past. And I'm brought on to see this person who's been seen as a naughty boy. And I find that the only way to make progress is to leave the issue that brought them to the coaching. Otherwise, the coaching's dead in the water. And often the perceived bullying may well be perceived as bullying, but there's a backstory. And so I used the first session to reframe what we're going to do. And I still will go with the Coachees agenda about how to make them and facilitate them in becoming even better in their leadership role. But I never allow it to be remedial coaching, because there's always two sides to this disciplinary story or naughty boy story or naughty girl story that's brought them to the coaching. Otherwise, I think you're not going to move forward. You're just going to get stuck on the past. So I try to avoid it being remedial and starting at zero, defining zero and defining what we're trying to achieve. and going with the Coachees agenda.
And of course, it can be very expensive, but it can be a very positive approach if everybody receives coaching of some sort on some sort of consistent basis, and that it's not seen that coaching is only brought in when there's a problem. And that can be a real mind shift, a very positive, innovative, growth-focused mind shift that an organisation can take, that we offer coaching and we offer development consistently throughout your journey with the organisation. We don't just bring it in when there's a problem. And I think that's a really important shift to be made to help view coaching when it is needed to be remedial. It doesn't stand out as such if it's just a normal part of everybody's growth and development journey.
And in the UK, I've heard some interesting comments within EMCC about creating a coaching culture in an organisation which kind of fits that model. But I'm conscious, just as we're talking, I'm thinking of an instance of being consulted about a situation where effectively a chief exec had some very serious allegations against them. And the closer you looked at the allegations, the more frivolous they seemed. So I went from how on earth has he come to do this to why on earth does anybody believe him? And it was actually pointing to a conflict elsewhere in the system, which was a whole different story. I'm wondering, conflict is one of the places which can cause coaching to be brought in. And I'm wondering how we've, either if our brief is to help resolve conflict, or if we discover in the course of coaching that there is conflict, which is why the coaching has come up, and we're helping a coachee navigate through that, perhaps to find a position which doesn't fuel the conflict.
Mark, may I just make one last comment about remedial? In the sense, first, I think we need to find a better name than remedial. But in that case, I think there is one very materially different factor, which is when I do this kind of coaching, the first thing I tell the coachee is, this is everything I have been told, because I think that honesty, transparency is extremely critical to lowering the psychological defensiveness, right? And I need to take the time that it takes to let the coachee know that I am as invested in mutuality, reciprocity, and respect. And you can ask me anything because I need you to trust me. I need you to trust that I am objective, I'm doing my best not to be biased, and I'm here to listen to you. But without that first statement of this is everything I've been told, and this is what I do not want to know, I don't think we can move very far with that kind of coaching at a deeper level. And there also has to be a degree of reconciliation, right? Especially when there is serious disagreement about the perception of performance. It's like we need to give them that time to just like name all the elephants and just get it out there, right? And then we say, okay, ground zero, where can we go? Where do you want to take this?
And just to illustrate that, I'm thinking of an instance of an HR professional being brought in a conflictual situation. And the giveaway of what was going on was when they laid out the information they had and then discovered the gap between that and the other side of the story. So it's actually, the whole significance lay in the fact that there was a misperception going on. I wonder if anybody has any anecdotes they might want to throw in about how conflict resolution coaching has functioned for them.
Well,
Gabby?
that always happens. Now, who goes first?
Happy.
Okay.
Ladies go first.
Oh, thank you. I think it's always fraught with danger in one sense. That sounds very serious, but from from what's been coming from the panelists, what Roslina is saying and Claire is saying, it brings it right back to, at its base, what is most important, and that's the human. It's a human on the other side that we're dealing with, and especially when it's conflict and it's seen as remedial, that we need to understand the human on the other side. And as Roslina was saying, all of those psychological defense mechanisms that can kick in, indicating the anxiety sitting behind the whole relationship and what's happening, that we must start there at that human level and work to alleviate that anxiety on all sides. And often it can not just be the coachee, but it's anxiety sitting behind the behaviour of the organisation as well, and possibly their reaction, and that we must start there, and we must come to the relationship with a level of compassion and empathy and perspective on just that human level, and at times taking away all of the organisational imperatives and the systems and the strategies. But before we can move into that realm, we must start at that most basic level that we all sit at. I find that can be a powerful way for a coach to approach a type of relationship like this when there is conflict.
I think as coaches we need to be very careful. Oh dear. I think as coaches we need to be very careful we don't perpetuate our art. I can remember a chief executive being given to me to be coached out of his wicked ways, and as I got to know him, we only did 3 or 4 sessions. It would have been easy to perpetuate that on, and in the end I said, this doesn't need coaching, this needs a mediation meeting between X, Y and Z, and it needs a different kind of approach. So I had to abort the coaching. Of course, I found the individual very interesting. We were doing some good work. We were heading on a very interesting leadership development path. But actually, it was more important that it was aborted and mediation took place, as intervention wasn't coaching. And yet organisations often don't even know what coaching is, and where it sits on a spectrum where you have psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, coaching, mediation, mentoring and training. They're all interventions designed, are they, to change behaviour, and they work in different ways. And I think there's an immense level of lack of understanding about what one intervention is meant to do compared with another. So even the original contract about what is coaching possibly underlines some of our discussion. Never mind the terms of engagement of the contract.
I would agree with you, Claire. And I think at this point in time, it's important for a coach to differentiate between a situation that requires mediation and can be resolved with mediation, in contrast with situations which have a rich context of conflict, wherein even if you were to mediate and resolve one conflict, the conflict actually has permeated into the substrata or into the culture or the individuals, and the other conflict is just waiting to arise the moment the first one is resolved. In such cases, mediation is clearly not going to be effective, and it's important to try and work with all the stakeholders to try and get them to introspect and see how they could change their ways so that what they are contributing to the conflict is essentially being rewound or taken back. Slowly, steadily, I feel a good coach or a team of coaches, when they work in alignment, can tend to unwind a conflict, not just a single conflict, but the very source and root of mistrust that has, come to beset a team or defines the interaction between a team. I think that is something which is very well done with coaching. And I would fully agree with you that not all contexts are contexts where coaching should be used. There are many which can be resolved either with consulting or with mediation. But definitely there are certain contexts where where the conflict is very deep rooted, and it's not limited to a context or to an event, but tends to perpetuate with every situation, it tends to manifest. I think coaching is very useful there.
Instead of a comment, I have a question. In terms of the conflict resolution coach, what should be the relationship between the coach and the group of people he or she is coaching? Should they be close or distant? Because for mediation, you try to be as objective as possible, so you don't have stakes in anything. But on the other hand, if you don't know them very well, you probably will ask the wrong question. I had experience where kind of a mediator with a private owned company in China, the two owners, a couple, had some disagreement with the general manager. They hired a professional. There are also conflicts between the couple themselves. So I was asking to help them solve some issues in terms of the management. I feel like because I know them all very well, I finally successfully finished it and also give them a template to solve similar issues in the future. But am I doing the right thing as a coach, or I'm just a mediator? Does the relationship help, or it actually prevents me from doing a better job? I was never sure.
May I chime in as a mediator?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think in the realm of mediation, objectivity is important for one very, very simple reason, and that is that both parties or all parties can trust you, can trust that you have their best interests in your heart, and that you are not secretly rooting for the other side, right? And or that you are solid enough that you are not being persuaded as a mediation goes on. It's actually very, very easy as a mediator to say, I like this person, I'm rooting for that person, right? So it's not to say that you don't do it. It's just that if you do it, you have to be extremely acutely conscious of your tendency to be biased. I, for example, accidentally fell into a mediation situation between a couple friend of ours whom I know, and I regretted doing it because I was not able to maintain that neutrality because I know both people, right? But I think in the realm of conflict resolution as a coach, I think maybe Bharat, you may have a bit more to say on that. My sense is that there's one thing that is very critical to do, because as a mediator, when I see the people in the room, the most difficult thing for people to do is I know what I want and I know how to ask for it. Without that, mediation is very difficult to come to a satisfactory place. And I find, at least in the adults I'm working with, it's actually not that easy for us to know what we want and to ask for what we want and not to be persuaded to change our mind. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't change our mind, but that clarity that this is what I need is missing. And that I see coaching coming in quite nicely.
Isn't there something there about the order in which one does things? You might be in a coaching relationship and then find that what is needed is something other than this, and you leave the coaching relationship and somebody else steps in and does a mediation with two parties. You might well pick up the coaching again afterwards, but to cross those boundaries, and again it's boundaries, so that you're mediating with somebody with whom you already have a coaching relationship, is going to cross boundaries that are just, it's not going to work. So by all means, pick up a coachee after mediation, but I don't see how you can be the mediator and be objective and hold your boundaries in place.
Yes, thank you. And in a sense, that speaks into some of my own background in group relations, where in a sense you're very, very precise about boundary, authority, role and task. And the sense is if you're stuck away from, if you start getting tempted to play silly Watsits with boundaries, that's something to note and take to supervision rather than to actually do. I'd like to move on. I'm conscious of where the clock's getting to. I would like to pick up some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat. But before we do that, I guess most of the participants will have got a rough sense of where we're coming from in terms of our ways of thinking about coaching, what our sort of models might be in the mind. Just might be helpful to people if we could be a little bit more explicit about that. Is there a sense of what of the model of coaching you're using or the framework you might be thinking about?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Mark.
That's
sorry,
all right.
Yeah.
Possibly I've made the coaching mistake of a question that's too vague, then you see where it goes. Just wondering if it might be helpful to name the model of coaching people are using, either if it's a well-recognized one or if it's something they've developed themselves. Just I'm aware that in the coaching world, people have referred occasionally to coaches with low skill levels. I've heard everything from glorified snake oil salesmen to people who are highly competent, and different ways of thinking about knowing what you're doing. I'm not sure there's any one way of doing it that's right, but I wonder, I suspect there's a variety of different approaches we're taking.
Mark, I am not sure that I follow any model. There's an instinctive one, but I would like to follow stakeholder-centered coaching. I would like to, I think it's the closest or the one that most appeals to me. And there are, of course, elements of the psychoanalytic approach that tend to come in, not necessarily as a model, but some elements of that approach. So I guess this would be my dissection of my coaching model.
I like to think that I would use whatever model might work for whatever challenge is in hand. And what I found interesting when I went on my coaching course many, many years ago was to find that things that I had developed myself actually had a label and were there already as a methodology. And I think it's very easy to get hung up on, should we use this method or that method? But I would take pieces from psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, coaching models, coaching methodologies in order to deal with the challenges in hand. And I wouldn't use labels to describe them because it doesn't matter really what the means is. What's important is getting to the end by a means that is appropriate.
Thank you.
I agree. Improvisation can be quite critical in the coaching process, depending on the coachee you are dealing with. Also, I'd like to add in China, because of 2,000 years Confucius teaching, people usually expect something more from the teacher or the coach. Sometimes they cannot differentiate. So usually you need to give a little bit of a more solution to them, rather than just asking questions and help them trigger thoughts. Chinese coaches tend to expect something more from the teacher. Otherwise, they'll question your credibility or authority or expertise. So that's something you also need to improvise on site. Yeah.
I find that oh, we've done it again. It's your turn, Bharat. I defer to you this time.
Thanks, Gabby. Mark, I think your point is very pertinent, and there are two parts to the coaching paradigm. One part is a set of general coaching norms, which I think a certification covers very well. And the other is a coaching model, which I guess is something which builds on these norms and can be very helpful to interpret a complex context. So, for example, if you look at Marshall Goldsmith and stakeholder coaching, or your analytical network coaching, any of these, I guess there are elements from all of these which perhaps each one of us intuitively connects with. So, over and above the fundamental coaching paradigm or the fundamentals, if we can connect with some element of each of these models, there is more for us to deliver, or it makes it easier for us to use from an established model to interpret the complexity of the context that we're dealing with. So I definitely endorse the fact that there are models and we should read upon. I would see that it's more my feeling that I've really done an exhaustive research or reading enough to benefit from them, but I do feel that there are certain models that on reading I find very instinctively and intuitively connected with. Gabby, over to you.
Thank you. I think it sounds like there's a common thread across all of us at the moment in terms of not necessarily working with one particular model and not being tied to a model per se. I completely agree. That I will tend to in my approach. And I find this very interesting, just listening to what Yili told us in terms of what is more expected from a coach. I maybe would not do very well in China because my approach personally is highly Socratic and so very much question-based. And it can sometimes be frustrating when you are not providing any type of solution, but that you are using the Socratic questioning approach to help the individual come to their own realization. And that in itself can be part of the journey that a coachee needs to learn, is that they're not going to be given the solution, that they have to arrive at it themselves. So that's very much forms the base of my model in a sense. And I also work very strongly on the theory of constructivism in regards to learning. That is, that we ultimately construct our own meaning, we construct our own understanding, we take from different people, like coaches, we take from the environment, but in the end, we are constructing our own meaning based on our own mental models, etc. And so again, if I was to describe my model, it is very much a very open-ended approach in that sense. And it is the coachee that is in control of their journey and the decisions that they make and the understanding that they come to. And it's my role just to support and help them navigate. So yes, I'd be interested to hear, Yili, if how that would go with people in China who maybe are more geared towards a much more structured, give me the answer approach, and how that would go.
I think you will do excellent in China. China has more than 1.5 billion people. I believe and we're also very diverse. There will be a group who are more, towards your approach, and they will appreciate that. Yeah. So don't worry.
Okay, that's good.
So to contribute my perspective after having done this for almost 2 decades, on one hand, while I think that a model is extremely critical for coaches who are engaging in an organizational setting, because you do have to communicate with absolute clarity what backbone you bring to the intervention. On the other hand, my experience has been that most coaches use frameworks as an excuse not to think and not to wrestle with the deep ethics of what the hell it means to be a human. Because if you don't have the capacity to wrestle with that becoming process, that agility, there is no way you can connect. And I saw some of this in the chat at the most fundamental level with your coachee, right? Because without that empathy, forget about compassion for the moment. Without that empathy, you can't journey with a coachee according to the essence of coaching that I think a lot of us has been schooled in. Now, that being said, at the end of the day, and then Gabby pointed this out earlier, we are in service to the humanity that is sitting in front of us with all his fear, with all her hopes, with everything that they're trying to say, but they can't say, or they don't know how to say. They're unconscious of what they're unconscious about, right? So, and to Yili's point, and I've had to do a lot of wrestling with this because I came from a coaching school that said, no, 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 you gotta make them do the work, right? And I've had coachees, like, and it's 4 or 5 o'clock, and they had a shitty day, and their humanity is just in heaps in front of me, right? For me, this is just my personal approach. What is the thing that I can do that is of the greatest service to this human being without crossing the boundary? And Claire's been talking a lot about this, of ethics, of my own integrity as a human being and as a coach. And if that means that I had to provide a little bit of a scaffold, maybe that's what is needed, right? But I do that with absolute clarity of what is the difference between a mentor, a coach, an advisor. I do it with absolute clarity that I'm not trying to rescue you. I'm not trying to hijack your story. I'm not trying to show you how smart I am. In that moment in time, I made a decision that this is the best way as a coach I can be of service to that human being. I may be right, I may be wrong, but that is part of the coaching process. We have to wrestle with all of this. And if you say that you are a co-active coach or you are, transformational presence, I say, how long was that? Like, if that is for the last 10 years, maybe you need to go do something else, right? Because I think as a coach, if we want to tell our coachee, you have to be agile and you have to change, we have to walk that talk first. And,
I think you're right. I wouldn't argue with you, but I do think it's very, very important that coaching is not seen as the acceptable face of therapy in an organisation. And I'm having most success at the moment with a very, very troubled woman in her mid-50s who came for coaching. And I have actually sent her to a psychoanalyst. And we're doing the coaching at the same time. And if you like, I'm working from the outside in, and a psychoanalyst whose methodology I know is working from the inside out and from the unconscious level. So those two things can run hand in hand, but they are separate and different. And I think there is a very great danger that although we must be empathetic and use our humanity to face somebody else's humanity, that there is a clear boundary between therapeutic intervention and coaching.
I couldn't agree more, Claire. I just say no to a client who really wants to work with me. And I say, very frankly, what you need now is a therapist. And for me, I'm very clear. If you're working with a therapist, my personal decision is I don't want to work with someone who is currently in therapy, because there's so many things that I have not been trained to recognize. I wouldn't know where I have overstepped, right? So that would be my personal take. And I completely agree with you. Is not therapy.
I'm going to refine on this. My take on this is that to come across situations which are so clearly compartmentalized into requiring coaching or requiring or maybe mediation. In my experience, you generally come across situations which have a peak around 1, but tend to have tails or some kind of a palimpsest which spills over into other areas. And I think what would be a good idea is to recognize the centrality and the core or the fundamental issue. And if that happens to be coaching, I think we should not put so much limits on ourselves. There is a certain degree of therapy that all of us can intuitively and instinctively do. Even before Freud came in, there was therapy. So I think we all need to recognize that as human beings, we can support human beings in front of us. Of course, if it turns out to be predominantly a case of therapy, we should direct it where it should be directed. But I guess to compartmentalize it so strictly would not be me. That's not me.
Thank you. Just coming in on that, because part of in a sense, my own background covers both sides of that. In the psychoanalytic world, I'd be very resistant to the idea of having outcomes, because I would see it as an open exploration and you're learning. And if you know where you're aiming to go, you've undermined the process before you've started. But I'm kind of conscious that in the coaching world, there's often a much better sense of what objectives might look like, what we might be trying to measure. There was a question in the chat a little while back about measurement of coaching outcomes. I just wonder whether that offers us any way to think about this and how we might go about measuring outcomes and seeing what we're actually achieving in this work.
I think that's
Can I
that's a.
Can I just request you to do that a little slowly? I missed a lot of what you said
Sorry.
because of network issues.
That's all right. It gives me a chance to say it more concisely. Just wondering about the measuring of coaching outcomes, with the sense that some of the therapy territory needs to be very much more open. But in terms of how do we go about measuring outcomes and getting a sense of the value of what's been achieved and charged for in coaching?
I was going to jump in there just with this idea around, I think, balancing having set outcomes from the beginning or set objectives, balancing that approach with the understanding that especially if it's an open-ended journey in one sense, that we can end up with different outcomes at the end, that often a good way to measure whether the coaching relationship has been successful is maybe not necessarily did we achieve the stated outcome that we had set at the beginning, but in fact, what level of growth has occurred? Because sometimes that growth and the outcome is different to what we had perceived at the beginning and is actually more beneficial, that we ended up maybe on the journey changing pathways and possibly coming up with a different outcome that we had started with. Sometimes it can be perceived as a failure. And again, it can be a shifting of your mindset that, in fact, how much growth has occurred in terms of where we started and where we now are at the end can sometimes be a better way of identifying what was the outcome that we wanted to achieve.
I think if the company is paying the bill, usually it expects certain kind of measurement, so it's always difficult because sometimes in terms of behavior change, you cannot really put an indicator or KPI on that. So that's why we need to be very clear at the very beginning in the contracting process about what we promised, what we are targeting to do, and what's out of scope, what simply cannot be done. Say, for example, high potential during program, if coach is part of the process, we can easily tie that to the decision of promotion or not. But for others, it's very difficult. I would try to escape from the, tied to the measurement part.
I'll share very, very concrete examples, I think, just to put some meat on the bone. One outcome which I've agreed to is a senior executive being promoted into a regional role, 22 countries, 22 cultures. And this individual came to me because there was a very real concern that there is a high turnover on her leadership team. Because I was very clear about what the outcome, we contracted for a 1-year journey because I said, there's no way to achieve this in anything less than a year, as an example. And in that case, the outcome was very clearly measured in 3 ways, right? 1, between now and then, did people leave, the leadership team leave because they can't deal with her, right? Did she become a better relational leader? Let's put it that way. Number 2, employee survey. And number 3 is her sponsoring manager's perception of how she is doing. Second case, British individual being promoted for the first time into Asia, leading a growth organization, being expected to deliver 500% growth in the next 5 years. Okay, this is a P&L situation. That outcome, by the way, is not P&L, right? Is to, and also having challenges with keeping the leadership team together across the region. The agreed outcome in there is number one, did this individual push back on the 500% growth? Because if you hired him to deliver on results, you should trust him to tell you how much he can deliver in that time. Number two, again, is leadership retention. And number three is employee survey. I think in some ways, I know it's really scary and it's something that I don't particularly like to be measured by. But I think as a coach, if we want to call ourselves organizational coach, we do have to try to find a way to link. It's not about behavior change because there's so many factors between what we're doing to whether or not in some ways our coaching intervention is contributing to either the bottom line or the top line of the organization. But it's up to you how you frame that. I don't think we should just receive it from the company and say, yeah, that's it, right? So it's a matter of negotiation. So that would be one way we as coaches, organizational coaches, can think about making our industry a lot more relevant and maybe even indispensable.
Thank you.
In fact, Roslina, we should go a step further. Irrespective of whether an organization seeks to put metrics, we should offer to put it up. And we have found that in almost every circumstance, it's possible to convert the coaching objectives into some form of a metric. And it could be that, if it's about improving delegation or empowerment, we are working only with course measurement tools like a 360 survey at the beginning or the end. And we define that change would be when there is a 2-point progress, not a 1 point, but a 2-point improvement on either delegation or empowerment. But irrespective, I think coaches should become proactive in offering a metric, a framework of measuring success and objective achievement to the organizations proactively. I think this builds trust and credibility with the organization that you are aligned with them and that you respect the value for the time and the money that they're putting into the process. And two, it brings more seriousness into your own commitment and your own focus on the initiative. I have found that it is rather helpful to work with this, though I wouldn't say it's here. I would say it is for the longer, for the larger good and for the longer term. It has longer term benefits. So whenever we've taken that up, I think now we've embedded it into a contract that we work with the organization to come up with metrics, to come up with objectives, and then find a way to come up with metrics that are acceptable to all parties and can be measurable, and including the methods to measure them.
Well, there are two things going on, aren't there? There are measurables, metrics, objectives, but there are also behaviors, and you get this echoed in the whole employee life cycle from the beginning when you're recruiting know-how and hard competencies, technical competencies, and you're recruiting a set of behavioral competencies. And some of this isn't measurable. And the way I've dealt with it, that I use a lot of psychometric profiling within the coaching process, not always just with the individual, but later with the team within they sit, because there isn't a remedial job to be done. It is a matter of complementarity within the team and using strengths. So when we talk about metrics, they're not numbers necessarily and measures per se. They may be behavioral measures. And if you use the right psychometric tool, that can be a very effective way of making progress.
Yeah, and I agree very much with bringing assessment in up front, like a pre-assessment, so that you create a baseline to begin with. And what a pre-assessment can also do is honour where the coachee is starting from. And sometimes we want the coachee to be starting from a certain position. Maybe we want them starting here. But in actual fact, when we start the relationship with them, and maybe the organisation wants them here to start with. Maybe in reality, they're actually starting further back. And so maybe a pre-assessment is a a more concrete way to determine this is the baseline, this is where the coachee is starting from, and then reassessing again at the end of the intervention to then see whether the outcome is achieved, but more importantly, I believe, is what level of progress has been made, and that the ability to progress and how efficiently and how much progress is made is often just as important as has the final outcome been achieved, because it's demonstrating that potential to grow and develop. And so topping and tailing your assessments can help you with that.
I think we're getting something confused, and I think it's fundamental. It's fundamental to the coaching process, and we're getting confused between assessment, a 360-degree tool type assessment, where third parties are giving their views on behaviour and know-how, and self-assessment, which is what the psychometric profiling tool does. And a 360-degree is not a psychometric tool. It is a behavioural comment from a third party. And if the coaching process is with the individual, then I'm not sure that 360-degree assessment is appropriate, because the success and failure of the interventions depend on the relationship of the coach and the coachee. So bringing in third-party interventions is a very different thing from using a psychometric profiling tool that is sophisticated in that particular function that it serves.
I think this is definitely, oh, sorry, Yili, I'll make mine quick. I think this is definitely an area where, as an industry, coaching needs to pay a lot more attention in cultivating. But the holy grail, I think Gabby and Claire combining it together, is a triangulation of data points, right? And not to forget that human beings, we are storytelling creatures. The narrative that we bring to this triangulated data point is as critical as to the numbers or to the self-assessment or to the psychometric, right? But I don't really see there's anything out there to help us coaches do that. So that would be a request.
Thank you. Just if I intervene for a moment, because there's something about how some really subtle psychometrics can tell you a lot about the individual and the team. We've got a poll that's ready to go, just to get a sense in the audience of how they feel on some of this. So if we could just bring that poll in, Abhijit. And whilst people are completing that poll, I'm also just wondering about the cultural aspect of this, because sometimes a really good psychometric gives you a sense of a cultural difference across an organisation. I'm just wondering how the cross-cultural, cross-gender dimension of coaching is playing out for us.
Sorry, could you just repeat? Sorry, just the end of that question. I missed that.
That's right. I was wondering how just thinking of the range of racial, national backgrounds and genders we've got on the panel, I wonder how the cross-cultural piece plays out in coaching, either in coaching across cultures, like a Brit going to Singapore, or for us working in our different contexts, because I suspect sometimes this can be a blind spot for coaches and coachees if you just assume the other person's coming from the same background as one is oneself.
Let me start by, I just want to add on Claire's point that 360 has its validity, but you need to be careful with it. Like I have a friend who tries to engage in a coaching assignment with an executive in the internet industry. So she proposed 360, but the executive replied, but my employee has a more than 50 rate per year. So if you do it after 1 year, half the respondents will be, they cannot comment on my change of behavior. So how is it valid? So I guess this is just one example of the cultural difference. I believe Bharat will say the same thing for India, the turnover rate in China and India is very high. People change job often time. And so we talk with the employee and starting by, we try to discuss your career perspective. What do you see in 5 years? People say, I don't know, because I don't even know where China will be in 5 years. So these are just some of the culture, pitfalls you may fall in if you bring a more westernized approach to China. In China, people, especially these days, it's difficult to strike a conversation about a long term. They are always thinking in terms of short term, nowadays. And with the COVID, people are just thinking about next month or next quarter. So this is one of the example I want to give. Culturally, the coaching supposed to be a long-term engagement, but people are thinking short term. So how do we solve that conflict? How do we, leverage that sort? That will be one thing. And second is in China, people looking up. I already said this, but people look at coach as a master. He should have the answer all the day. So he can ask a question, so I can think of the answer myself. But they thinking as the coach as a Confucius. He definitely has an answer. He just didn't share with me yet. So that's why a lot of coaching assignments was difficult to agree on, because I introduced several excellent coach to senior executives. They talk with her or him and say, he's excellent, but he didn't have experience in our industry. How can he or she coach me? So that's always a difficult selling point. So yes, that's just my inputs from China. Very brief. China is a very big, diverse country. I'm not expert in any way. That's just my 2 cents, 2 observation points.
Yes, I can remember working simultaneously with 2 people from mainland China who were so different. It gave you a sense of the folly of trying to say all Chinese are the same. Just the results of the poll we did a moment ago, suggesting that about 70% of people see a mismatch between the psychometrics. Well, have got the result. But also interesting to see the variety of different metrics in play. I think I saw a reference from Claire to Luminous Spark in the chat a moment ago, which is a very subtle one, which is actually very good at telling the differences between individuals, the context they're in, and how they might go under stress. But just picking up on what Yili said, I wonder if there's sometimes an issue about the coach as somebody who's seen as having all the answers, and the coachee might sometimes need to feel it's that way, but the coach also needing to get out of the way so they don't actually impose something on the coachee.
I think with this gender and culture issue, it may be a bit passé in the sense that I think for those of us coaching in the multi-cultural perspective, we know for a fact that there is really no such thing as culture as it was understood 20, 30 years ago. We have people holding multiple passports, speaking multiple languages, looks one way outside, completely something else inside. So the affinity, I feel, is more on an educational level. Did we go to the same type of school? Is experience level. Do we enjoy the same kind of holidays? Do we enjoy the same kind of dining experience? Philosophically, do we read the same books? So I think the chemistry check, at least that's what all coaches should be doing, is to kind of suss out, is there enough affinity at the value level for 2 people to connect and to commit? And this is, I think, one thing that we don't talk enough about in coaching. We are both committed to discovering each other and not to categorize either one of us. Because the reality is my coachee is judging me, is categorizing me, is assessing me, right? But there has to be that mutuality that we are prepared to recognize that, put that aside, and can we connect at a deeper level? So it may be that gender will get in the way. It may be that my ethnicity will get in the way, or it may not. But I don't think it's that clear cut, that black and white. Is it gender or is it culture, right? It may be that, oh my gosh, Yili, you were in Google. Oh, geez, right? Because Google has become my primary cultural identity. And we can completely connect because we're from Google. Who cares which school we went to, right? So there's an organizational level, which is why a lot of M&As don't work, because I just hired a whole bunch of people from Google and I'm SAP. It does not connect. So that may be a bit more important. But I have one point about psychometric. I think it's very dangerous to think that psychometrics have predictive ability. I think the moment as coaches, if we go down the track, it's like, okay, we can't talk. I'm done.
It just might be worth dangling the thought that culture is a noun and a verb. So if you talk about someone's culture, it's static. If you talk about culturing somebody, that's a whole different energy, and how we have been cultured might be a way of describing how we are, but it's also not static.
I like that, Mark. I think it speaks to the organic nature also of the coaching relationship. And it brings it back to what Roslina said, that when it all boils down, it is, do I connect with the human on the other side? And there can be so many variables that come into play in regards to connecting with the human on the other side. Of course, I think also that that's one of the most important skills that we bring as a coach, that our ability to find a way to connect with the other human, cross cultural boundaries in some ways, and connect at that most basic of human levels, and the importance of building the rapport with the other person on the other side. That in one sense, that is one of the most important things to start with, regardless of the coaching model that you may use, or regardless of the assessments that you bring in, that is a very important piece. And I think that can help with good coaches being able to work across different cultures, if you bring those skills to the table as well.
Thank you. That, in some ways, like a very good summary of coaching. I'm conscious that we're coming towards our time boundary. But there's one more poll we'd like to put up, which is about how useful the 4 typologies we've named might be. Just really interesting to see how the participants in the call have reacted to that. So that'll be coming up in a moment. And this is the 4 typologies of preparing future leaders, overcoming constraints, remedial coaching, and conflict resolution. So if we could have that poll now. There's now a pregnant pause whilst the technology does its stuff. Technological gremlins are remarkably good at intervening in this modern world.
Just add to Gabby's last comment. Sometimes if we are from same culture, it helps to build a rapport. But sometimes if we have come from different culture, we don't understand each other. Maybe it's also good, because then I have more respect of you. Like a Chinese see Gabby will say, "Oh, he's an Australian working overseas. She must have something, you know." And then when you give him constructive feedback, he will believe you. Say, "Yeah, she has nothing to do with China, so she must be objective." So it can work both ways.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Interesting point.
A pro tip to, I think, Mark's question and to Yili's comment, like, you know, coaches are supposed to be sage. At some point, all of us coaches would have been asked this question: tell me, what do you think? You know, what is your opinion? What should I do? And I've learned to ask this question: how does my response matter to you? Right? And see what they say.
I think the technology has defeated us on the last poll. I'd like to draw this webinar to a close and thank everybody very much for their participation. The poll has finally arrived. If you're able to indicate on there, that will be wonderful, and that'll probably come back as Bharat closes this morning's webinar. But thank you to everybody for taking part. I've been delighted to work with such a varied panel, and to be reminded I'm working with people across the whole world. So if I can pass over to Bharat.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to each one of you in the audience. along with you. I think it's been a very useful session for us. I'd like to personally thank Yili, Gabby, Claire, Roslina, and not to mention Mark for participating so wholeheartedly, sharing your views, your experiences. The audience too has been very supportive and kind. Your instant feedback, your constant questions and comments have been very encouraging. We plan to run some more sessions in a couple of time. We are firming up our plans on that, and we'll be in touch with you on those. Thank you so much once again, and namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.